You don't salute in front of me. You worship war. I fight against it." The words were venom, spit across a room that had just gone still. Then came the sound. A fist, flesh meeting bone, sharp, wet, undeniable. The old man's face snapped to the side. His glasses flew off. His coffee cup fell and shattered against the tile floor. A gasp rippled through the diner. The aggressor stood over him, tall, loud, face flushed with rage. His leather jacket creaked as his chest rose and fell. Tattooed fingers still curled from the strike. The old man didn't speak, didn't raise a hand in defense. He simply reached, slowly, shakily, for his glasses. Blood from his cheek smeared the lens. He blinked once, eyes stinging, and turned his head back toward the small American flag hanging near the register. And then, with the steadiness of muscle memory forged long before this morning, he raised his hand again and saluted. The man who hit him laughed, loud, cruel. "You want to keep pretending? Like any of this means something? You're a ghost, old man." The diner held its breath. A fork dropped somewhere near the counter. The waitress froze mid-step. No one moved. No one helped. The silence was thick, not with reverence, but with fear. Then a chair shifted in the back corner. A shadow passed across the tile, and a calm voice, deep and measured, came from the door behind them. "You better stop right there," because someone else had just walked in. And he had seen everything. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The man who had taken the blow, who still sat, hand raised in salute despite the pain, was Charles Granger, 84 years old, former sergeant, United States Marine Corps. In town, most just called him Mr. Granger, or, among the few who still remembered the old stories, Sergeant Granger. He had come to Molly's diner every morning for the past 11 years, always at the same time, 7:15 a.m. without fail. Rain, snow, aching bones. It didn't matter. If the American flag was hanging above the front register, Charles Granger would be there to greet it, with a salute. He never made a scene of it. There was no grand gesture, no patriotic declaration, just a quiet rise from his seat, a long look toward the stars and stripes, and the raising of his hand. His elbow bent with age, his knuckles gnarled from time and injury, but the motion still carried the weight of command and memory. Today, the blood that now trickled from his temple ran down the collar of his flannel shirt. His fingers trembled more than usual as he fumbled for his glasses. One lens was cracked, and the frame was bent. He tried to adjust it anyway, hands moving carefully, like they had done this kind of repair before. The man who had struck him, Ethan Cole, lingered nearby, pacing. His breathing was heavy. He looked like a man wired with anger that had nowhere left to go. His voice, earlier loud and smug, had quieted now, though not from shame. Not yet. Just waiting for another excuse. Across the room, Jenny, the waitress who'd been serving Charles since her early 20s, stood frozen behind the counter. Her apron was stained with coffee, her eyes wide. She had never seen Charles fall before. Not when he'd slipped on the ice last winter. Not even when he'd passed out once from low blood sugar. He had always caught himself, always risen on his own. But now he was shaken, still saluting. A slow, horrified hush had fallen over the diner. The regulars, men in work jackets, retirees nursing their second coffee, two teenagers on their phones, sat as if glued to their seats. Not one had stood. Not yet. Charles gently reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photo, worn and faded at the edges. He laid it on the table like a sacred relic. Two young men in jungle fatigues stared back, one with an arm around the other. The print had been touched so many times the faces were almost smooth from wear. He stared at it for a moment, as if remembering something the rest of the room could never understand. Then, with effort, he turned back toward the flag hanging above the register. His jaw clenched. The welt on his cheek had begun to swell, bruising fast. He raised his hand once more, slower this time, and saluted again. Ethan scoffed behind him. "If that's your idea of honor, old man, no wonder the world's gone to hell." The words bounced off the walls. No one answered, but their weight lingered, thick, bitter. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. A leaf scraped softly across the glass door. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the ceiling fan and the slight clatter of a fork being set down too hard in the corner booth. Molly's diner had never felt this quiet. Charles kept his hand raised, fingers barely steady. His breathing was slow, shallow, but steady. There was no defiance in his posture, just an unshakable, deliberate calm, like this moment, this insult, didn't deserve his anger. Or perhaps it was beneath it. Jenny finally stepped forward, cautiously, placing one hand on the back of the nearest chair. She looked from Charles to Ethan, back to Charles. "Mr. Granger, do you need help?" Charles didn't answer. He kept his eyes forward. "Charles?" She tried again, her voice now breaking. Still nothing. Not yet. At the far end of the room, an old man wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars ball cap rubbed the rim of his coffee mug with his thumb. He didn't speak either, but something in his gaze had changed, sharpened. Ethan turned toward the flag, still hanging silently above the counter. "I see this country worships symbols more than people. You salute that thing every morning like it ever did a damn thing for you." His voice echoed again. More words, more poison. But this time, someone heard footsteps. From behind him, the front door creaked open. Boots touched the tile. Ethan turned. The man who entered didn't speak. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his uniform sharp despite the dust of travel on his sleeves. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes, dark and steady, landed first on the blood on his father's cheek, then the tremble in his raised hand. Charles didn't turn, not yet, but the corners of his mouth twitched, just a little, as if he knew his son had arrived. The air inside Molly's diner hung heavy, like a room trying to exhale but forgetting how. Plates of food sat cooling on white ceramic, forks rested idle. Every set of eyes moved between the blood on Charles Granger's cheek and the man pacing near him like a caged dog looking for another excuse to strike. Charles had not spoken, not since the blow. He'd simply resumed what he came to do, his morning salute, as if the violence had merely been weather to pass through. He slowly lowered his hand now, wincing faintly. The muscles in his shoulder pulled tight. Then, without hurry, he reached for his coffee cup, or what was left of it. The ceramic had cracked in three, one piece still spinning softly against the tabletop from the moment of impact. His fingers brushed a shard. He drew his hand back. Blood appeared, but he didn't react. Instead, he reached again, more careful this time, and nudged the largest piece toward the corner of the table, away from the photo he had placed so deliberately. The photograph remained untouched. Two young men in jungle camouflage, smiles thin but proud, standing with their arms thrown over each other's shoulders. One wore his helmet askew. The other was already missing two front teeth. Brothers in uniform, twin souls in a war that took more than it gave. From behind the counter, Jenny moved slowly now, wiping her hands on her apron without purpose. Her voice had left her. Her eyes kept flicking to Charles as if trying to will him back to the present. Charles reached into his coat again and drew out a small silver container, the kind that once held loose tobacco but now held 3 white pills. He set it beside his coffee saucer, now empty. With a trembling hand, he flicked the lid open and paused. The fingers of his right hand struggled to lift the pill. It rolled, slipped. He tried again. In the booth behind him, Ethan Cole watched with an expression that mixed disgust and grim satisfaction. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that almost resembled a grin. "Look at this one," he muttered to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the room. "Takes 10 minutes to cross the room. Still thinks he's in a damn war zone." No one laughed this time, but no one stopped him either. Charles kept his head down, finally pinching the pill between his thumb and finger. He placed it on his tongue and washed it down with the last cool sip of his coffee. The room, once a place of warm chatter and morning rituals, had turned into a theater of tension. Even the clink of cutlery had stopped, replaced by the soft mechanical buzz of the soda machine and the ticking wall clock that seemed louder than usual. A teenage boy at the window, the one who always came in with his father after early soccer practice, whispered, "Is he okay?" His father didn't answer, just kept staring forward, lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Charles adjusted in his seat, slowly. His back had begun to stiffen from the impact and the cold. He touched the edge of his bruised cheek, the gesture small but deliberate, as if mapping the wound's exact dimensions. Then, with both hands, he reached for the photo once more and repositioned it in front of him, straightening its edges as though it were part of a ritual far older than the insult. He took a deep breath, not to speak, but to prepare, and then he stood, slow, one leg at a time. The bones in his knees cracked softly under the strain. He gripped the side of the booth for balance. His hand lingered there, fingers curling into the wood grain, as if drawing steadiness from something older than him, from something that remembered his strength. He turned quietly until he faced the flag. It was small, hung just above the service window where orders were passed through. Its red had faded slightly, its stars not perfectly aligned in their stitched row. But to Charles, it was still the flag, still the promise. He raised his right hand again. No one moved. Not a word came from Ethan now, just a scoff, dismissive, as if the moment were beneath him. He leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. Charles's hand trembled more this time, but the line from shoulder to brow was straight, his gaze fixed, unwavering. To most, it may have seemed like the stubborn act of an old man clinging to a habit. But to Charles Granger, this motion was not memory. It was devotion, a private prayer made public, one that had outlived friends, commanders, his own twin brother, and even the fire in his own limbs. Behind the counter, Jenny wiped her face with a napkin, her hands shaking worse than his. In the booth beside the window, an older gentleman removed his hat, bald, with spots on his scalp and eyes clouded by age. But he knew. He remembered. He'd seen it once before, in a different time, in a different place. He bowed his head, but no one else stood. Not yet. Outside, the autumn breeze kicked up dust in the parking lot. A pair of boots appeared near the threshold. The glass door slowly swung open, letting in the wind, the scent of turning leaves, and something else. Presence. Charles did not turn to look, but something in his expression changed. Just slightly. The left corner of his jaw clenched. His chest rose with a fuller breath. A man doesn't need to look when he recognizes the rhythm of his own son's steps. And someone new had just entered. Someone who had not missed what was done here today. Ethan Cole rose from his booth with the same energy as a storm surge, sudden, charged, and ready to destroy whatever had the audacity to stand still. His boots struck the tile with a thud that seemed too loud for the size of the diner. The sound startled the nearest customer, who quickly looked down into his coffee, pretending to read the rim of his cup. Charles Granger remained standing, facing the flag. His hand was still raised in salute. The swelling on his cheek had deepened in color, casting a blue shadow beneath his right eye. Blood had dried in a thin line across the ridge of his cheekbone, disappearing beneath the strap of his hearing aid. Still, he didn't move. Ethan approached slowly this time, arms out, pacing like a man preparing a stage. His voice was lower now, but sharp as broken glass. "You think you're making a point?" he said, stepping closer. "All you're doing is clinging to a lie that should have died with the war." Charles didn't respond. "You think standing here in this outdated place, staring at that flag, makes you better than anyone else?" Still, no response. Ethan stopped just behind Charles. The silence was suffocating, a deliberate challenge. Then, with deliberate malice, he reached out and swept the photograph off the table. The sound of it hitting the tile wasn't loud, It was soft, paper and dust. But it landed like a gunshot in the center of the room. The booth behind Charles gasped. Jenny dropped a glass. Charles turned, not fast, but full. His salute dropped for the first time. He bent slowly, reaching down with careful fingers, brushing the edges of the photo as if picking up the broken body of something sacred. His knee cracked. The movement clearly pained him. But he did not ask for help. He rose, one vertebra at a time, and returned the photo to its place on the table. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't need to. "I served with them," he said, his voice low and steady. "One came home, one didn't." Ethan chuckled. It wasn't humor. It was mockery. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay Marines." Jenny flinched at the words. One of the teenagers at the back lowered his phone, guilt crawling across his face. "Leave him alone," someone muttered. Too soft, barely a whisper. Ethan turned his head. What was that? Silence again. Charles began to lift his hand once more, slower this time. There was a tremor in his fingers, the effort causing his shoulder to spasm lightly. But he completed the gesture. Hand to brow, back straight, chin level. Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief, then contempt. "Oh, for God's sake." And then, he shoved him. 2 hands against an 84-year-old spine. Not hard enough to throw him down, but enough to make him stumble. His leg hit the edge of the booth. He gasped, caught the side of the table, and dropped again to one knee. The same knee that hadn't bent without pain since the late 90s. There was a sharp intake of breath from someone near the register. Jenny's voice broke through at last. "Stop! Stop it right now!" Ethan turned, eyes wild. "You gonna do something about it, sweetheart? Or just cry in the kitchen like the rest of them?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Charles stayed on one knee, hand on the table, his breath coming in quiet bursts through clenched teeth. He didn't look up. He didn't ask for help. A man at the far booth, flannel shirt, quiet eyes, stood up halfway, as if torn between decency and fear. He hesitated, then sat back down. His face crumpled into something that looked like shame. Ethan walked toward the door, pacing in small circles now. "This is the country you all cling to? A room full of sheep, letting a fossil wave a flag like it still means something." He stopped, eyes scanning the room like a man daring someone to answer. No one did. Charles used the edge of the table to pull himself up. The motion was slow, deliberate. The diner watched every strained breath, every inch of rising bone and effort. He adjusted the photograph again. Then the flag. Then his body turned back to its post, and he saluted. He stood there, broken and bleeding, and saluted again. His hand wasn't straight this time. It wavered like a candle in the wind, but it was there, still there. Behind him, the diner began to shift. The weight of silence changed, not louder, just charged. And then, from behind the glass front door, a shadow moved. The door creaked. Boots touched the floor. Ethan's shoulders tensed. Charles didn't turn, but he didn't have to. He knew the sound of his son's footsteps. The door swung shut behind the man who had just entered, sealing the room in stillness once more. For a moment, nothing moved. Only the air seemed to change, subtly charged, like the moment before a storm reaches the ground. But it wasn't the sound of boots or the broad-shouldered presence near the entrance that held the room in place. It was what the old man did next. Charles Granger did not turn to see who had arrived. He didn't need to. The rhythm of those footsteps, calm, sure, measured, was burned into his memory like smoke into an old uniform. He had known those steps since they first padded barefoot across a farmhouse floor 40 years ago. They were heavier now, shaped by discipline, but still his son's. Instead of greeting him, Charles took a long, slow breath and reached once again for the photograph that had been knocked from the table. His fingers moved gently across its creased edges, smoothing the worn paper as if it were a fragile artifact. His hand trembled only slightly now, not from fear, but from care. The image was faded, edges soft, color nearly bled to sepia. Two boys in jungle camouflage stood in front of a corrugated hut somewhere in the highlands of Vietnam. Their arms were thrown around each other, helmets crooked, dirt on their faces, pride in their eyes. Charles knew the photo so well that he could still remember the exact smell of the air that day. Rain-slicked trees, burnt gunpowder, wet canvas. He set the photo down again, precisely in its place, aligning it parallel with the napkin dispenser beside it. Then he picked up the second object on the table, a small black comb, and began to run it once through his silver hair, slicking it back into neat lines. It was a motion without urgency, almost ceremonial. Not for vanity, not for image, but for dignity. He adjusted his posture, back as straight as he could manage. Then, inch by inch, he raised his hand again. His fingers barely cleared his brow. The shoulder, now stiffened from the shove, fought back, but he completed the gesture. He stood there, saluting once more, and this time, it looked like it cost him something. From behind the counter, Jenny bit her lip, her hands trembling as she reached slowly for a towel, unsure if she meant to clean something or just give them purpose. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. The blood on Charles's cheek had dried into a fine crust, cracked at the edge where his skin had moved. The red mark where Ethan's hand had landed was visible now in the sunlight that filtered through the window, a jagged outline of a moment the room would not forget. Ethan scoffed from the corner. "You just gonna keep doing that? You really think standing there like some broken-down statue makes you better than the rest of us?" Charles didn't reply. The wind moved the flag above the counter ever so slightly. Its corner lifted, then fell. The room seemed to lean into the sound. Then Charles spoke, soft, steady. "I knew men who never got the chance to grow old," he said, eyes still on the flag. "They'd give anything for one more morning like this." His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't proud. It was something deeper, the weight of memory worn like a second skin. "I don't salute for me." He paused, as if measuring each word before speaking it aloud. "I salute for them." The diner was silent. Even Ethan didn't respond. Not yet. A chair creaked near the register, but no one stood. The fear still lingered. That invisible chain that binds decent people to their seats when evil wears the disguise of volume. Charles lowered his arm slowly. His shoulder dropped. His breath came in shallow, measured drags. He took his seat once again, but not with defeat. The way he lowered himself, stiffly, carefully, was like a man taking position in a foxhole. Not running, not retreating, simply settling into the next phase of the moment. He reached for the spoon beside his saucer and stirred his now lukewarm coffee. He didn't flinch at the bitter heat when he took a sip. He simply nodded once, as if confirming it still had the bite he preferred. At the door, the man who had entered, the son, still hadn't spoken, but his eyes swept the room, first to the blood, then to the man who'd caused it, then finally to his father, seated, wounded, unshaken. The weight of that glance, that connection, was like a silent signal between men who had known war, even if not the same one. Men who had fought, carried others, buried pieces of themselves, and yet rose each morning out of discipline, not desire. Ethan, now pacing again, muttered something under his breath, but the son was no longer watching him. He was watching the man with the cracked glasses, the comb in his pocket, and the photograph that refused to curl at the edges no matter how many times it was dropped. He was watching Sergeant Charles Granger, and something had shifted. The old man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't stood tall. But the ground beneath the diner had begun to tilt, because dignity, when held long enough under pressure, starts to burn through silence. David Granger did not walk into the diner like a man looking for confrontation. His boots stepped lightly on the tile, but they landed with weight. He paused just inside the threshold, his figure framed by the rectangle of morning sunlight that poured in behind him. The shadow of his silhouette stretched out like a blade across the floor, reaching nearly to the feet of the man who had struck his father. He wore the same fatigues he had deployed in. Dust still clung to the cuffs. His sleeves were rolled neatly at the forearms, revealing a single bracelet on his wrist. a thin cord of green and black, frayed near the knot. His jaw was tight, but his expression was unreadable, composed, calculating. The room, which had already grown quiet under the weight of what had happened, now felt like it was holding its breath. David didn't look around. Not at first. He looked only at Charles. His eyes scanned his father's frame with precision, the cracked lens of his glasses, the blood dried in a crescent along the jawline, the slow, deliberate motion of lifting his cup as if nothing had happened, as if he were simply continuing the routine. But David saw more than injury. He saw the strain in the shoulder, the barely noticeable tremor in the hand holding the coffee, the subtle way Charles shifted his weight to ease the pressure on his bad leg. A flicker passed through David's expression. Not rage, not sorrow. Awareness. "Morning, Pop," he said, voice even, measured. Charles didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the flag. David stepped forward. 3 strides. Then he stopped beside his father's table. His left hand rested on the back of the booth, fingers curled just above the wood, not quite touching. The rest of the diner was watching now, not with morbid curiosity, but hesitation. Something was changing, and they felt it before they understood it. Ethan turned his head at the sound of the greeting. His eyes landed on David, the uniform, the posture, the stillness. And for the first time since he'd entered, a trace of something else crossed his face. Not fear, not yet, but hesitation. "You know him?" Ethan asked, half laughing, gesturing at Charles like he was a stranger at the zoo. "You here to pick up Grandpa or just grabbing coffee before the next war?" David didn't respond. He turned to look at Ethan, slowly, not with dramatic flair, but with the gaze of someone assessing a target, not threatening it. His eyes were calm. That made it worse. "Who touched him?" he asked. His tone was not sharp. It was something far quieter, a kind of precision that made noise unnecessary. Ethan shrugged, but there was tension now in his stance. The casual mockery was fading from his posture, replaced by something stiffer, defensive. "That old man was trying to make a statement," Ethan said, his voice still elevated but less confident now. "I made one back." David tilted his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. "You have 60 seconds to sit back down," Ethan muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the counter. "Or we're gonna have a bigger problem." David didn't look at him again. He didn't move toward him. He simply lifted the phone and tapped once. The screen lit with a contact labeled O'Connor, then Torres. 2 messages, 3 taps. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Outside, the wind picked up again. Leaves scraped across the parking lot. Charles, still seated, didn't break the silence. But his eyes had moved now, not to Ethan and not to the flag, but to the reflection of his son in the window glass. There was something in that glance. Not gratitude, not relief, certainty. Behind the counter, Jenny felt her hands stop shaking. She didn't know why. Nothing had been said. No one had touched the man who caused this. But something had shifted in the oxygen of the room, like the sound of incoming thunder, still distant, but inevitable. Ethan took a step backward. He didn't know why either. Maybe it was the way David hadn't raised his voice. Maybe it was the silence of it all. Or maybe it was the way Charles had just turned his eyes from the flag to his son, and then saluted again. Slower this time, steadier, a different kind of salute. Not to the country now, but to the man standing beside him. Not for service, but for blood. David stood still. His chest rose once. Then he looked at Ethan again. "You shouldn't have touched him." David Granger remained still, one hand resting lightly on the edge of his father's booth, the other hanging at his side like a weight that had been carried across continents. His face held no anger, no strain, just focus. The kind carved into a man by too many years of being the last voice in the room when everything else fell apart. He didn't move, but the front door opened again. The bell didn't chime this time. The wind had stilled it. Instead came the sound of boots. 2 pairs. Deliberate. synchronized. Quiet enough not to startle, firm enough to command attention. The two men who entered were not dressed for ceremony. No medals, no brass, no shine. Just the dull olive drab of men who served not for show, but for each other. Private first-class Roman Torres, wiry, sharp-eyed, his dark hair buzzed clean, and beside him, Sergeant Malik O'Connor, tall, broad-shouldered, a presence that seemed to expand across the room even when he stood still. Neither man spoke when they entered. They didn't need to. Torres's gaze swept the diner with tactical precision. He took in everything in a single glance: the broken coffee cup, the photograph, the dried blood, the shaking waitress behind the counter, the old man seated with a rigid spine and hands stained with dried red. Then he saw Ethan Cole, standing a few feet away, posture twitchy, jaw tight. O'Connor moved toward the counter. He didn't look at the menu, or the specials board, or even Jenny. He pulled his phone from his belt, opened the contacts list, and calmly tapped the 3-digit number that didn't need any introduction. His voice was quiet, almost casual. "Yes, this is Sergeant Malik O'Connor. We need officers dispatched to Molly's Diner on Hillcrest. Assault on an elderly male. Suspect is still on site. We've got multiple witnesses." Then he ended the call, returned the phone to his belt, and stepped back. Ethan's posture changed. All the bark had left him. His feet shifted restlessly. His eyes bounced between the two new arrivals and David, who hadn't moved a step since the call was made. "You called the cops?" Ethan asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Torres tilted his head slightly. "I did," he said, voice neutral. "I'd do it again." Ethan glanced at the door, then the windows, then back at the Marines, and he moved. It was instinct, raw, dumb panic. A sharp pivot toward the exit, pushing past the edge of a booth, nearly knocking over a half-empty plate of pancakes. But O'Connor was already there. He stepped once, not fast, not aggressive, and planted himself between Ethan and the door like a wall that had always been there. His arms didn't rise. He didn't even clench his fists. He just stood. Ethan stopped. "Get out of my way," he barked, voice brittle now. O'Connor's voice was soft. Too soft for shouting. Too soft for panic. "You're not leaving." Ethan's chest rose sharply. "You can't stop me." O'Connor shrugged once. "We already did." The room was silent. The kind of silence that happens not when people are afraid, but when they've seen the scales tip. When something true and solid and overdue finally steps into the room and refuses to be ignored. Charles Granger hadn't moved from his seat, but he had watched it all. Every word, every glance. His eyes, still ringed with a fading bruise, now held something else. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but confirmation. As if the moment he had been waiting for, not just today, but perhaps across years of quiet dismissals and shrinking dignity, had finally arrived. David turned to his father now. "Pop," he said gently. "You all right?" Charles didn't nod, didn't answer right away. He lifted his cup, took one last sip of now-cold coffee, and set it down with the precision of habit. "Didn't drop the coffee," he said, voice quiet, hoarse. David smiled, just slightly. The corner of his mouth twitched, the way it used to when Charles would finish a job without asking for help. Then, behind the counter, Jenny stepped forward. Her hands were no longer shaking. Her voice was tight, not with fear now, but righteous fury barely held in check. "You raised a hand to a veteran in my diner," she said, every syllable sharp. "You're lucky all you're getting is handcuffs." Ethan opened his mouth and said nothing. Torres turned and stepped behind him. He didn't touch him, didn't threaten him. He just stood too close. Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding and slumped onto the edge of the booth. He put his head in his hands. The room held its shape. The three Marines now stood in a triangle, not rehearsed, not planned, just there. Ethan wasn't in control anymore. And now, the whole diner was watching. Not because they wanted to, but because they finally knew what it meant to stand for something. The weight in the room did not vanish with Ethan's stillness. It simply settled, like ash after a fire. His figure, slumped on the edge of the booth, seemed smaller now, not just in posture, but in presence. His defiance had dissolved, leaving behind only the residue of fear and the awareness that something larger than him had entered and found him wanting. But no one was looking at him anymore. All eyes had drifted, as if pulled by gravity, back to Charles Granger. He still sat in his booth, rigid, weathered, enduring, the crack in his glasses catching the light like a scar across a story untold. His hand hovered above the photograph again, fingers brushing the edges with the same delicacy a man might use to handle a flag draped over a casket. David stood beside him, not as a soldier now, not even as a son, but as something in between. A witness, yes, but also a mirror. Their uniforms bore different insignias, different decades, different wars, but they both wore the same weight. That quiet burden passed between generations without ever needing to be named. He reached forward, slow, deliberate, and gently picked up the photograph. He turned it over, revealing the back, where faded handwriting still clung to the yellowed paper. Just two names, a date, and a single line. One fire, two shadows. David stared at the words for a moment, his thumb grazing them. Then he looked at his father. "You kept this all these years?" Charles nodded once. "Every day," he said. "In my pocket, even when I didn't want to remember." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't filled with fear or shame. It was filled with the hum of understanding. From across the room, Torres and O'Connor watched. Neither spoke, but something subtle passed between them, a glance, a breath, a recognition that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with honor. Then, without a word, O'Connor stepped forward. He walked slowly, not toward Ethan, not toward David, but toward Charles. He stopped beside the table, straightened, clicked his heels once, then saluted. Not flashy, not loud, but exact. The kind of salute given only from one warrior to another, across time and service and wounds that never made it into the paperwork. Charles didn't salute back, not because he couldn't, but because this was not his moment to reply. Instead, he looked up, just looked, and held O'Connor's eyes. And in that gaze was everything: the jungle, the dust, the blood, the names he could still recite, even though their faces had long faded from memory. Torres followed suit. A second salute. A second silence. Then both men dropped their hands and took a single step back. They said nothing. In the corner of the diner, Jenny finally let her tears fall. Not in sobs. Just a slow leak, like something unclogged inside her after a long, clenched morning. She picked up the glass Ethan had knocked over earlier and returned to her station without a word. And that's when it happened. A soft scrape of wood on tile. From the booth near the window, the old man in the Veterans of Foreign Wars cap stood. He didn't speak. He just rose and faced the flag. His posture was not what it used to be. His right leg dragged slightly. His hands had begun to curl at the edges from decades of arthritis. But he raised one of them now, slow, uneven, and saluted. No one told him to. No one asked. But something had changed in the air, and he knew it was time. A few feet away, a teenage boy, still holding his untouched plate of waffles, watched him. Then, unsure, he set down his fork and slowly stood up too. He didn't salute. Not yet. But he watched, eyes wide. Across the room, another figure rose. A nurse from the hospital down the road, still in her scrubs, a stethoscope draped around her neck. She didn't know Charles, had never spoken to him, but she stood anyway. She felt the shift, and she wasn't the only one. People weren't just watching now. They were standing, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. For the first time, they saw not just a man who saluted every morning, but the reason behind the ritual, the pain, the promise, the silent brotherhood that needed no words to name itself. David looked around the room. His eyes passed over each standing figure. The veterans, the civilians, the waitress with tears in her eyes, and then came back to his father. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small bronze pin, worn with age, the emblem of his uncle's old unit. He set it gently beside the photo. "You carried him home," David said quietly. "Every day since, even when no one saw it." Charles's jaw tightened. He looked down at the pin, then to the photo, then to his son. Their eyes met, not with emotion, but with something far stronger. Recognition. They were not the same men, not the same wars, not the same pain, but they had both carried something heavy, and they were not carrying it alone anymore. The bronze pin on the table caught the light in a way that made it gleam like something new, though its edges had dulled with time. The symbol stamped into its surface, a winged insignia, and an etched number, had long since been rubbed smooth by fingertips that had reached for it too many times in the dark. David had placed it with care beside the photograph, not as an offering, but as a marker, a sign that the silence had gone on long enough. Charles stared at it for a long moment. Then he drew a breath, not a deep one, not a steady one, but a breath that had been waiting, stored behind his ribs for decades. He reached for the photo again, lifting it between thumb and forefinger, holding it not for himself now, but for everyone else. "That's my brother," he said softly. "His name was Thomas. We were born 4 minutes apart. Same cry, same crib, same boot camp." The words were not rehearsed. They sounded like they had once lived at the bottom of a locked drawer, unopened for too long. He never talked much, smiled even less. But when the shells dropped, when the brush lit up like hellfire, he didn't flinch. The diner was frozen now, not in discomfort, in reverence. Charles's voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It just carried. Even the air seemed to stop moving to listen. "We were near Da Nang, April 72. Night ambush. Didn't see it coming. Mortars, flash grenades. And then it was just screaming. Fire everywhere. I took shrapnel to the leg. Went down fast." He tapped his thigh once beneath the table. The movement was subtle, but the meaning was not. He was closer to the blast. Took it in the side. I told him to stay down, to wait. Medevac was inbound. He paused. The silence stretched, thick and fragile. But he crawled to me anyway. Dragged me across the mud. 38 meters. I counted. Jenny raised a hand to her mouth. The waitress, who had watched him order toast and coffee every morning for years, had never once imagined this part of him. That beneath the polite smiles and the tired salute was a man who had been dragged across a battlefield by his dying twin brother. I told him to leave me. He said, "We started together. We end together." That was the last thing he said. David's hands were resting flat on the table now. His eyes never left his father's. "I held him," Charles continued. "Held him till he went cold. Didn't scream, didn't cry. Just listened to the wind. That jungle was quiet after." He reached for the pin. "This belonged to him. I never wore it. Wasn't mine to wear. But I carried it, same as I carried him." The line fell like stone into water. He was 19. The boy in the corner, the one who'd stood earlier, now sat with his hands clasped in his lap, eyes wide and full. He looked not at Charles but at the flag above the register, as though seeing it for the first time. Charles placed the photo down again, then the pin. Then, for the first time that morning, he leaned back, not in retreat, but in release. The room remained silent until a voice, hesitant, quiet, rose from a booth near the window. "He's the reason you salute every day, isn't he?" the voice asked. It was the old man with the Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. His voice cracked on the last word. Charles nodded slowly. "I told him I would. 3 words, that was all. I told him I would." The weight of them didn't come from volume. It came from the simple fact that Charles Granger had done exactly that. Every morning. Same time, same table, same silent vow. Even when no one watched. Even when they laughed. Even when they struck him. Jenny stepped from behind the counter again, this time not to clean, not to serve, but to stand. "That story should be on the wall," she whispered, not buried in silence. But Charles shook his head gently. "No walls, no plaques, just this." He pointed to the flag, then to the photo, then, finally, to the people now standing all around him. "That's enough." A pause. Then David, his voice firm but low. "Not anymore." He turned toward the room, not to preach, not to command, but to speak what had gone unspoken too long. "This man you watched bleed today. He carried his brother out of a battlefield with half his leg torn open, and when they offered him extraction, he refused until every man in his unit was accounted for." His voice didn't rise, but no one looked away. He didn't ask for thanks. He never once told that story. He didn't wear his medals. He didn't complain when he was mocked. He came here every morning to keep a promise. He turned back to Charles. "And I think it's time everyone here knows that." Charles looked down. He didn't speak, but his eyes glistened, not from sorrow, but from the strange weight of being seen, truly seen, at last. 1 week later, the bell above Molly's diner door rang as it always did, soft, unimposing, like the voice of someone who never needed to raise it to be heard. Charles Granger stepped inside with the same slow, measured pace he had kept for years. His cane tapped gently on the tile, more from habit than need. The sunlight filtered through the windows, just as it had before, casting golden lines across the checkered floor. But something in the room had changed. He felt it before he saw it. The air was still familiar. Bacon frying, coffee brewing, the hum of quiet conversations. But it carried with it a kind of reverence. Not the exaggerated kind reserved for veterans on special holidays. No slogans, no rehearsed applause, just stillness. Stillness that had learned something. Jenny met him halfway from the counter. No clipboard, no order pad. Just a simple smile, gentle and unforced. "Your booth's open, Charles," she said. "I've already got the coffee started." He nodded once, his lips forming something close to a smile, but softer, as though unsure if this warmth belonged to him. Still, he moved to his seat without hesitation, sliding into the familiar corner beneath the flag he had saluted 1,000 times. The flag itself had not changed. No new threads, no polish or frame. But someone, no one said who, had repositioned the spotlight in the ceiling, just slightly. Now, in the morning hours, its rays caught the fabric directly. It didn't glow. It didn't gleam. It simply stood visible. A small group sat 2 booths away, 3 older men in flannel jackets and faded caps. They had the look of men who remembered how to read maps before GPS and how to change a tire without asking for help. One of them raised his coffee cup in Charles's direction, just enough to be noticed. Charles returned the gesture with a small lift of his own. He didn't need to ask their names. They didn't need to say a word. Some things spoke louder in silence. Torres and O'Connor sat at a table by the window. Neither wore uniform now, just clean jeans and soft cotton shirts. Civilians again. But when Charles entered, they had risen quietly to their feet for just a second, long enough to show they still stood with him, even without orders. David arrived minutes later. No fanfare. He entered as his father always had, calmly, humbly. His hand rested briefly on his father's shoulder before sliding into the seat across from him. Jenny brought out the coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar. And then, something unexpected happened. One by one, other veterans began arriving. Not in formation, not all at once. But as the minutes passed, the tables filled. Some wore pins, some didn't. Some arrived with family, others alone. Some sat near Charles. Others simply nodded from across the room. But all of them came. Not because of the story, not because of the punch. Because the truth had been pulled into daylight, and it had asked them to stand with it. The diner staff didn't call attention to it. There was no announcement, no photo op. But Jenny, without speaking a word, began sliding 2 extra chairs to Charles's booth. Then 3, then 4. He didn't protest. He simply moved his coffee slightly to make space. And just like that, the table that had once been a solitary ritual became something larger. Not a shrine, not a stage, but a place to belong. A younger man, no older than 25, approached with hesitation. He didn't wear anything to mark him as a veteran, but something in his eyes told the truth before his words could. "My grandfather never talked about his service," he said, "but he always saluted like you do. I didn't understand it before. I do now. Thank you, sir." Charles nodded. He didn't rise. He didn't reach out. He just looked at the young man, held the moment with a steady gaze, and replied softly, "I was just keeping a promise." The boy smiled, then turned and left, as quietly as he had come. By mid-morning, the diner had filled beyond what a Tuesday morning usually warranted. Not bustling, not loud, just full of presence. And though Charles had not saluted that day, not yet, it no longer mattered whether he did, because the room now carried the weight of the gesture for him. The recognition wasn't plastered on the walls. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way people entered more slowly, in the way voices softened when they passed his booth, in the way some hands hovered near their brow when they passed beneath the flag, not in habit, but in honor. A quiet tradition had been born, not declared, but chosen. The next morning, the fog rolled in low and slow over the sidewalks of the town, brushing against the store windows like a memory that hadn't yet burned off. The street lamps flickered their last before the sun fully claimed the sky. It was early still, too early for most places to stir, but not for Molly's diner. The windows glowed soft amber from inside, warm, familiar. The same door opened as it always did, its bell giving that gentle chime, one that didn't demand attention, only announced something dependable had returned. Charles Granger stepped inside. He wore his navy coat again, the one with the small pin, his brother's, now stitched onto the inside flap, where only he would see it. He didn't walk any faster than before, and he didn't expect anything to be different, but something was. Not because of any single action, because of what had been built, slowly, quietly, over time. He approached the counter first, as he always did. Jenny was already there, pouring black coffee into a waiting cup, steam curling into the air. "Morning, Charles," she said, the way she always had. But this time, her voice held a new layer. Not pity, not ceremony, just respect with roots. "Morning, Jenny," he replied, as though they were both agreeing that yesterday had happened, and that today mattered just as much. At the booth, two veterans already sat, one reading the newspaper with his glasses halfway down his nose, the other staring quietly out the window at the passing cloud bank. They looked up as Charles approached. The one with the paper folded it slowly. "Your seat's still yours," he said. "We're just keeping it warm." Charles smiled, and for once the smile didn't have to fight its way past weariness to be seen. He took his place at the head of the booth. He didn't say much, didn't need to. The others shifted slightly in their seats, not to make space, but to open something else. Space in presence, space in trust. Across the diner, a father and son entered, the same pair from the week before. The boy paused at the door, then looked up at his father, unsure. His father gave a quiet nod, and the boy walked over. He stopped at the edge of Charles's booth, standing straighter now, like he'd practiced. "You saluting again today, mister?" he asked, eyes hopeful. Charles looked up at him, and for a moment, he was looking through him too, through time, through every morning he'd stood alone, through every morning that silence had been his only witness. And now he nodded once. "Every day, son." The boy raised his hand. This time the salute was a little better, a little straighter. Charles raised his in return, not sharp, not for show, just enough to let the boy know he saw him, that it mattered, that it would always matter. The boy smiled and returned to his seat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But when he sat down, his feet no longer swung beneath the booth. He kept them planted. Charles lowered his hand. The coffee steamed beside him. The chatter of morning filled in the corners of the diner again. Not loud, not distracted, just alive. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The sky opened its colors. Inside, a man who had saluted in silence for over a decade now sat with others. Not alone, not forgotten, not invisible, just seen. And as the flag above the register stirred gently in the warm air, Charles Granger closed his eyes for a moment, not to retreat, but to remember, to honor, to breathe, because the promise had been kept, and now it was shared. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.